Hello and welcome to the AI for Good webinar series. My name is Gillian Makamara from the International Telecommunication Union, which is the UN specialized agency for ICTs and the organizers of AI for Good in partnership with 38 UN sister agencies and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of artificial intelligence to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. The global pandemic, which is still impacting us today, has shown us that we need increased readiness in our response to it and to similar challenges that may occur in the future. In the past 2 years, numerous initiatives have come up that leverage AI and machine learning to offer solutions to help us manage in this difficult time. And today, we will introduce an effort that is in the same spirit called Project Resilience. This is a project under the Global Initiative on AI in Data Commons that has a vision to create a public AI service where people all over the world can come together to develop or use a collection of data and AI approaches to solve challenges faced today, such as the pandemic and any other challenges in the future. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and they're counting on you, the participants, to make this a lively and engaging session. So please feel free to put down all your questions in the Q&A and any and all comments in the chat. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom, you can find the Q&A and chat functionalities at the bottom of your screens. And now I'd like to hand over to Amir Banifatemi, who is the chair of the Global Initiative on AI and Data Commons, to kick us off by giving us some insight into the Global Initiative and Project Resilience. Amir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is a true pleasure to share with you today the official announcement of Project Resilience. This is a project we've been working on for about a year now, and there is a history behind that that I'm going to be sharing with you. Let me share my slides with you at this point. As suggested before, there is a chat and Q&A channel. Please ask your questions on Q&A so we can answer them in the order we receive them. And we're going to be sharing that with you. So let me share my screen and get started. So today we're going to be doing some general introduction and giving you some updates about the project, and specifically introducing to you the working groups by each chair and the timeline that we have in mind, and share with you how you can participate and join, and some general Q&A. So without further ado, let me start it. So the starting point of this effort was a global competition, a global collaborative competition launched between Cognizant and XPRIZE and ITU and a number of other partners, where the goal was in 2020 to identify methods and mechanisms so we can come together and identify ways to solve and answer questions about how we can effectively build data-driven systems to accurately predict COVID-19 transmission rates, and do that while we help prevent and mitigate scenarios to get back to economy and save people at the same time, get back to on track to normal. So this competition was under the assumptions that an AI for good system can be developed that will help many countries, many communities at the same time. How can we answer the questions about what is safe to do in terms of opening schools, opening nurseries, opening businesses, travel, but at the same time keeping people safe? So this effort was launched in 2020. There was a $500 challenge that we launched, and these are the partners that started this together. This challenge was successful. We had about 140 teams that gathered from different parts of the world, and it was eventually won by 2 teams from Valencia and Slovenia. These are just for background information about this project. And what we learned is that, in fact, we have managed, and Babak will share a bit more on that with you today, we managed to identify ways to create predictive and prescriptive models that could really help policymakers and those decision makers about mitigation and intervention to make decisions between 2 topics: how to save people and how to get back on track faster. So this gave us the opportunity and the idea that, in fact, this is not the only time we have a pandemic and there are going to be more coming up. How can we imagine having an always-on online AI system that would be more predictive in nature and which every community in the world can benefit from? Are we able to create such online system? So that was motivated us to launch and work on Project Resilience, which is in essence a global collaboration to provide an open and publicly available series of cloud-based AI predictors. And more on that later today. So this effort has been worked on since May of this year, and we are presenting to you today the outcome of this preparation and what we're planning to offer to you today. So Project Resilience is basically based on three elements. First, a platform where collaboration can happen to build predictive and prescriptive models, and that can be used by any community. So we're going to be talking about that later today. The second element of Project Resilience is to identify data and guidelines to support sustainable models. If we identify predictive models, how those models can be sustained over time, is data always available? Can we have access to only public data, or should private data be submitted? And how should we go about identifying that data and providing guidelines for those who want to support to participate? And finally, to make sure that this is truly a global effort, what are the stakeholders that need to be involved? Are they policymakers, data scientists, community activists, healthcare organizations, and how should they be using such a system when it is in place? So these three layers are what we have identified, and you can see them in this diagram, high-level diagram, which captures the type of users, which is the AI consumer, which could be anyone, the AI contributor with models and data, the supporters providing funding support, cloud support, any form of support, and the regulators that need to make sure that anyone have access to an always-on AI predictor. And obviously, every user will have to interact with the system, and that system will be based on a sandbox that will help identify models that could be eventually deployed with the deployment plan. So we're going to go back to this diagram, but this diagram is a first attempt at capturing the vision of this project, and this diagram could evolve over time based on our work, but also your own input. So the first stage of this Project Resilience is in fact a platform. And this platform that we call Platform MVP is working group number 1. And I'm going to be inviting the chair, Babak Hojat, to get us through the work that we're planning to do together. And Babak, let me know when you want me to turn the slides.
Will do. Thank you, Amir. Thank you very much. Yes, so as Amir said, one thing that we noticed working on the Pandemic Response X Prize as the pandemic was unfolding was, to our surprise, there are many, many teams that are working locally on gathering data, on trying to predict how the pandemic will affect them locally, and then trying to come up with methods, policies to tackle the pandemic locally. And so what we're trying to do in Project Resilience is to abstract that out so that for other similar global problems, we can actually tackle them in a more cohesive global way, bringing together these local efforts and creating a whole that's bigger than the sum of its parts. So if we go to the next slide, please, Amir. Yep, there we go. Yes, so essentially we need a place where people can go to contribute on all of these counts. And so the MVP is this start for a place. You can even think of it as a portal where these different teams will come in and know where to go in order to contribute, not just define the problem, but also contribute that bit of the problem, even locally, that they have tackled. Again, ranging from the data to the models that they've built, the definition of the problem itself, how it might actually, work best locally for them. So that is the first and foremost what we are trying to tackle. As an MVP, we are trying to make it, there will be some coding. So the volunteers and folks that are going to be joining us, hopefully, in this project need to know that for the MVP track, we are actually going to build something, not the least the portal itself, but also the means for people to be able to sort of harmonize their contributions into a larger whole. Beyond that, though, we're trying to make sure that everything is through guidelines and standards that allow people to sort of interchange their contributions, and so that that their contributions can gather value in this larger whole. So a lot of the work on the MVP is going to be on guidelines, standards, and NPI. So if we go to the next slide, please. Right, so this is the chart that Amir showed. As far as the MVP is concerned, we are going to be primarily focused on the AI contributions, various different models, facilitating that and facilitating the sort of bringing together of these models into a larger model that we can use globally and actually transfer learning from one model to another, from local models to each other, as well as a sandbox for some thresholds for performance and some sort of ensembling, some very minimal ensembling of these models so that they can actually be put together, and a deployment plan that takes us all the way to one cohesive kind of whole as far as the system is concerned. So that's kind of what we want to touch. It is important for us to actually get the end-to-end going on an MVP, even if what we're selecting is the minimum criteria and minimum requirements necessary. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here's the way we look at the system. Now, the terminology is obviously up to us how to decide, but typically in a system like this, data is gathered, usually locally, and in some cases globally. In the case of the pandemic, we were lucky to have people like Oxford University who actually harmonized data across various different geographies. And so there's contributions on the data side that the platform needs to be able to handle. Then there are contributions on the predictor side. So most of what we see in this pandemic, for example, is what's going to happen next. So give me a model that looks at the data and locally tells me whether I'm going to hit a surge in the number of cases or things are going to be okay, what level, what am I looking at from hospitalization perspective, and so forth. So if someone is building such models, then we want to be able to bring those models in. And so there will be contributions on this forecasting and predicting that takes place. Note that we are not prescriptive as far as what kind of models we're expecting. It could be SCIR models, it could be simulation based, all the way to, somebody is building some form of random forest or XGBoost or neural network based. We really don't care. So as far as the MVP is concerned, we treat the model as a black box. However, we do standardize through guidelines what we expect the input on the model to be and what we expect to see on the output. So what is it that the model is actually predicting? And roughly, we categorize that as context and action. So we're saying, within a certain geography, with certain characteristics and history, there were certain policies, certain actions that were taken. Given that, we want the model to be able to tell us what's going to happen next, and that's what we call outcomes. A third category of contributions are prescriptions. And these are a form of optimization. It could be through AI-based models, machine learning-based models. We use evolutionary computation for this, but various different approaches exist for that. But essentially what these models do is they take a context and tell us what to do, which we can then take into the predictor model and get a sense of what's going to happen if we do it. So it will provide us with some kind of what-if scenario interactivity. And so that's the third component here that the MVP needs to taking into account, which is not really predicting what's going to happen next. It's actually prescribing what should be done in order to hit a certain balance of outcomes that we're looking for. In the case of the pandemic, these were, minimizing cases as well as at the same time minimizing the economic cost, and some balance of that was desired depending on the geography and the situation. And so what we want to do is allow all these contributions into a cohesive system that then can be actually actioned locally. The full loop has to be there as well. So we need to be able to collect more data and through time over a reasonable cadence, be able to update the data, update the various different models. So if we go to the next slide. So our working group over the past couple of months has been looking at a rough high-level definition of what the MVP should look like. Here are some assumptions that we took for the MVP. Again, it's an MVP, so we assume the data is already there. It is public, does not have any security issues. The models are being called and run on the submitter's local machine. We're not providing, a place for the models to be developed or trained or deployed. We're assuming that they're actually already running on the developer's machine. And we do want transparency. So we want the full process of the model training disclosed. So that's an assumption that that is already disclosed for us. So if we go to the next slide now. So as far as the goals for the MVP are concerned, there is some building involved. So there is some coding that we have to do in order to accommodate the various different types of models that are submitted. We do need a bare essential automated model to do some minimal assessment of the models that are being contributed and submitted to this greater whole. And this will require some basic ensembling so that we can actually put the models together and make sure that they complement each other. We don't expect to actually get the model itself. All we need is, for example, at the submission level, all we need is, a CSV file of inputs and outputs that the model has generated. That would be sufficient for, the initial assessment. And then once we're actually getting to the ensembling and next steps, what we would like to get is sort of an API that we define that we can call at any point in time and receive outputs and some cadence of training and retraining of that API. So very hand wavy at this point, but we need to get into the details of how that would be defined. The other half of what we do, very, very important, is to actually provide guidance, to put together documentation, clear and concise documentation that helps the teams take their models and be able to apply the standards so that it can actually match and be used in this greater whole. And that's both on the UX side of what we expect in the hosting of these systems, as well as some data needs, requirements, and format so that we can actually consolidate the data as well. There's some storage and compute needed as well. We are looking to contributors to provide some of that for the MVP itself. This is going to be used for assessing the submitted models, as well as we will provide some guidelines for third parties who want to host certain aspects of the MVP. In the next slide, please. Yeah, so just very high level, what are non-requirements for the MVP? We're not going to be a data clearinghouse. That's a major operation that we cannot undertake. We're not going to provide storage or compute for training and updates of models. This would be, of course, very useful for various teams. We do realize that. I don't think it fits the MVP prerogative, but hopefully at some point along the project, we will be able to provide that as well. And we're not going to be providing a deployment user interface. We will provide the standards and guidelines for building one, but we are expecting the contributors to actually be able to build their own UX given the data and models that are consolidated in the platform. So next slide, please. So we have some next steps at this point, and we really do need to expand the team and get people to assume some responsibilities around these various different aspects. We do need to create a project management Kanban. We've been kind of running based on a common document so far, some task lists, and because this does involve some coding, we do need to treat it as a programming sort of project. Some of the tasks we need to do immediately is to create an outline of the architecture, high-level module definitions, requirements, API and data requirements. We will have to work very closely with the other teams, especially the data team, in order to come up with some of this, and to also put together the dev requirements for the project from the IT perspective, as well as, of course, people who are going to work on it. So the next slide has a very rough, high-level outline of if we have the volunteers and we actually kickstart this in November, we feel that we can get to an MVP stage by February if the will is there. And I'm not going to read off the slide here. You can just see some of what we're going to be doing. It's basically a reflection of what I already mentioned. But ultimately, we will have a UX, an automated assessor, and hopefully an MVP release by February. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Gyumyong, or Amir, you're going to pass it on to Gyumyong, either way.
Yeah, thank you very much, Babak, for this thorough explanation. The second step in the project resilience is the data contribution, and the co-chairs Gyumyong Long, professor at the University of Liverpool, and Toby Phillips from Oxford are chairing this. I think Gyumyong today is going to give us the highlight of that. So Gyumyong, I will be, first welcome and thank you. And I'm going to be turning the slides as you asked me to.
Okay, thank you, Amir. Thank you, everyone. So I would like to briefly introduce data-related aspect as a chair over data contributions. So firstly, as you can see in the high-level view of the resilience project, I would like to indicate the several important building blocks related to data. Particularly, we need AI contributor. So each contributor will be in charge of various kind of points, such as some models and data. Particularly, data is really essential element for considering AI techniques for predictive analysis. So when we consider various kind of a data aspect, we also well identify the certain importance of regulatory concerns. Some regular compliance issues are also very important. And then we can commonly consider sandbox for validating or some checking some feasibility of technical solutions over models and the various kind of things. Then deployment is also one of a common part with the MVP. So based on this kind of a background information, I would like to introduce next step. So actually data contributions is really related to various kind of other working group, particularly MVP, we just recognized. So we really need to consider data sharing, especially for data sharing. We have well identified the importance of standardization. So in this regard, data sharing in a standardized way with the interoperable interfaces are really fundamental point for this data group. So before going into details, I have well identified the various kind of important element as a key considerations. Particularly, we first needed to know individual contributors and their roles. Then, firstly, we focus on how to collect the data into publicly available data. I believe this one is a really important stage for the beginning part. And then we continue to develop our solution to consider data quality issues, aggregating data. There are lots of things to consider, particularly curate data. So this is a really important considerations for sharing with the common data models with some shared taxonomies also. And then we needed to align with the MVP, particularly 3 data features: context, action, and outcomes. And then whole data life cycle is also one of the important elements. While conducting this kind of a full element, so we also need to well ensure security, privacy, and trust as a common part of our considerations. Next slide, please. So in the next slide, so in this regard, based on this kind of analysis, we wanted to consider 3 important goals and mandates. So first one is to develop guidelines for data contribution to project resilience. And then secondly, we needed to develop relevant specifications for interoperable data, particularly data sharing for AI and machine learning. And lastly, we also would like to emphasize case study. So this is really important things to share our experience with the contributors. Next slide, please. So in the beginning stage, I believe around 3 months from now on, so we first need to concentrate on deliverable number 1 to develop guidelines for data contribution. So for this part, we first identify important directions for data value chain and the related contributors. So based on this kind of given conditions, so we intend to identify relevant requirements and analysis these requirements, especially for publicly available data or data sets. So then what type of data set, what type of standards, so that kind of things might be very important as an initial stage. As I already indicated, security, privacy concerns are also one of the important things. We also need to think about legal compliance issues. Then this kind of initiatives can be quite important input to see various kind of standardization efforts. So first of all, we wanted to consider gap analysis for reviewing our existing standard, and then hopefully we can clearly identify various kind of potential work items to be standardized in the future. Next slide, please. Then next year, after the phase 1, we intend to go into details for various kind of different angles. So first of all, we needed to go into details for guidelines. So I believe just 3 months might not be enough. So then next year, we continue to develop various kind of important elements, particularly for the data aspect regarding peer data principles. This is some critical point for technical aspect, and then interoperable data sharing. Then deliverable 4, this one is very important point for specifications. So then we can go into details with the in-depth analysis of technical choices and the development of related technical specifications. Then finally, in the deliverable 5, so this one is a case study. So rather than just considering this kind of quite a valuable effort, if we consider to share our experience among contributors, I believe this one is a very good thing. And then we really needed to encourage this kind of activities. So that's the overall view of our data group. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyu-Myun. So we talked about the MVP, the platform, and the data. The third piece is the product experience. If we're able to build such an online service, how would that be useful? How people can use it, and what the mechanisms are for interacting with it. So I'd like to invite Mohanty and Sean Gregor, chairs of this working group, to talk more about that to all of us. Thank you. Mohanty.
Thanks, Amir. So product experience is a rather technical term that many people on this call may or may not relate to. So I'll actually try to set the stage. The premise is that what we are trying to do here is solve an extremely challenging problem, which will definitely create a massive impact, hopefully touch billions of people. Now, Babak explained the technical aspect of the whole project in the beginning, and that itself is a large and complicated technical piece, which has its own technical challenges. And I personally have been thinking about numerous technical aspects for quite some years right now. But if we're really thinking about creating the impact, while we are also focusing on all the nuances of the technical components of this large puzzle, we also have to think about who are the users who will use this whole project, who will benefit from it, how will they benefit from it. So in this diagram, you actually see the product experience team deals at all the interfaces. The goal of the product experience working group would be to really understand who these users are. Who are the people who are coming up with the problems? Who are the people who are coming up with solutions? Who are the people who are eventually benefiting from them? And finally, we actually started by trying to define some of these roles, right? But we also start with the premise that this is our initial assumption. And as we go further into actually putting it out in the world, we realize that we will have to do some course corrections here or get a better understanding of the users, build better technical components, so on and so forth. Can you have the next slide, please? So the initial stakeholders we defined were these people called as problem scopers, right, who define what gets solved. Then data validators who come in and formalize the data that is needed to help solve these problems. Then solution builders. How does it get solved? But we want to move a bit further ahead. We care about storytellers. What happens if you solve a large technical problem? If the general masses do not really understand, if the regulators do not understand what exactly was solved and what is the potential impact of it. Then we have decision makers, policymakers, governments who will eventually facilitate how these solutions will impact these billions of people we want to touch. And finally, the consumers. Who are these billions of people who will benefit from this whole puzzle to magically work at some time? For this whole thing to work, the way we wanted to start was to focus on three key things. Can I have the next slide, please? We wanted to focus on the user personas, user interaction stories, and product feedback cycles. Again, three very technical terms. But what we're trying to say here, in the previous slide, I mentioned about these problem scopers, these solution builders, and these storytellers, whatnot. But these are real people, right? These are actual stakeholders who will eventually be using this system. Someone will come up and say, I have this problem that needs to be solved. And someone somewhere will be like, I have a solution which can solve this. And someone says, oh yeah, I can help people understand how the whole thing is being solved. And finally, some organization will be like, let's roll it out, eventually benefiting all these people. Right now, we are starting with some assumptions of who these people are. And we do have some experience of imagining what these assumptions are. So our assumptions are decently good as we get started. But while we are preparing all the technical components, we also want to invest as much energy as we can on really understanding who these personas are. We start by hypothetically imagining these personas, by putting a name, a face, a background to them, their incentives, what drives them, what might be things that they could be insecure about, what might be things where they would be extremely charged to help make this happen, so on and so forth. Once we find these hypothetical personas that we start with, we would also want to map them to real-world personas that we know, real-world personas that you know. Some of these real-world personas are you right here on the call. And once we kind of get a better understanding of who these personas are, we also go into user interaction stories. We start again by coming up with hypothetical scenarios in which these user personas for which we have names, sketches, faces, they interact in these large complicated setups where they come up with problems, and we define the exact problems in these user interaction stories. And then another user persona who is maybe a PhD student somewhere comes up with a solution, and we kind of lay out multiple such scenarios, and that becomes these user persona, user interaction stories. And the goal of these first two components is to create a shared decision-making framework as more and more people come in to help build this large, complicated, help us solve this large, complicated puzzle. So while we are taking these large technical decisions, we are still very well connected to what these users want. And across all the working groups, whenever they have to make decisions on which features to prioritize, which features to deprioritize, they have stories of real people and our assumptions on hypothetical people, along with our discourse, well-documented discourse with these real personas available to help them make these decisions. And finally, going to product feedback cycles, the goal was, while the overall technical components of this whole project matures, we would need to connect the whole development plans and everything else around those to real users and establish what are the key milestones we are looking at and how the input, how the feedback from these users can be collected. So again, that provides a feedback which can be helped to optimize our internal flows while we are developing this large system. And our concrete plan, can I have the next slide, is to, in the first phase, focus on two things: identify these users, contributors, supporters, observers, and anyone who is just a cheerleader who wants us to kind of succeed. But we kind of do it in as thorough way as we can, where we, as I said in the beginning, we really want to understand these users, put a name, a hypothetical name, or if it's a real user, a real name to that. And same for these user interaction stories. So in the first bit, we are really trying to kind of get a better understanding by having some initial conversations with real stakeholders, while also putting in a lot of effort to actually imagine these stakeholders. And once we have developed that confidence in our initial assumptions, which would also be initially validated, then we go all in into the second phase. Amir, can I have the next slides? In the second phase, we basically go all in on engaging these stakeholders. The assumption that in the first phase, we already have a decent enough understanding, not decent, a really good understanding of who these stakeholders are. We start to build and maintain these relationships with these organizations, individuals, which are kind of represented by these personas, and then connect them with the other working groups who are already charged up and working on these technical products, which are taking shape already. And we start evaluating an engagement at a testing scenario. So while we are developing this, we do not wait for the whole project to kind of be complete before we start taking feedback. So we start kind of engaging with these users early on to kind of get some early feedback. And we also start establishing a clear plan of action on how we can establish the KPIs that are needed for user engagement, what processes that need to be in place for product feedback, and actually evaluate what are the benefits of a system like this. In the beginning, I started by saying we really are ambitious to kind of really positively impact as many people as we can. But here we start to think in terms of these user interaction stories to not only imagine, but also talk with these real users to already start imagining what the benefits would be. And finally, we want to end with finding deployment opportunities where we can actually complete the whole loop and say that at the end of this whole story, we have actual consumers who have benefited and all the stakeholders along the way who have taken part in this large complicated process. And much of the role of product experience group would be to enable this whole process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohanty. We have a number of questions on the Q&A, and please add more questions if you have. So the question is now how to participate, and this is where we're going to be now inviting you to share with us what's interesting in the project and how you think you can contribute, or what you think we should be doing more than what we explained. And this is a journey we're starting and we're passionate about it. So what participation means, pretty much? Well, there are multiple ways to contribute. One is that to provide existing open source models, both on prediction and prescription, either around COVID-19, which is recent and a lot of work have been done, but also future pandemic or disasters or anything that would impact society and would need to benefit from such approaches. Also, if you have access or knowledge about public and private data set that may enhance or improve and help us focus on these efforts, that's another way to contribute. But definitely expertise and time to contribute and enhance implemented models is important. We're going to come back to that a little bit more. And also the time and skills associated with building tools. This is not a project about governance or a promotion of AI that benefits society, which is important to do, by the way, and we'll be doing this, but this is about building an example of an open, available to anyone, predictive modeling system that could help society mitigate choices and decisions. And this is a basic starting point, and there's so much work to do. So to make sure that these frameworks are available to a non-data science community, we need to make it easy. And as Mohanty said, understanding how this can benefit people or every stakeholders is important. And we always work on the models, but we need to think about people as well. And this is something that we want to get from the beginning. So what are the skills that we'll look to invite, and regardless of your background, we're looking at these capabilities, of course, technical program management, and naturally AI, ML, and data science, dev and system ops, UX, UI, and issues around legal, security, privacy, as we talk about data and access as well. So these are what we're trying to do, and this is pretty much the presentation of the project. We're going to be starting in November, and then I will invite you to join the Slack channel. This is on the chat there. I think there's a link on the chat, but there's a short link as well, bit.ly/project-resilience if you want to join Slack. And also you can email us at pr@ai-commons.org for more questions if you have to. But I'd like to answer some of the questions that we already had on the Q&A, and probably go through them and see who can answer that. There was a first question, I think, that we did answer, but I'd like to go back to it, which was about benchmarking models and fine-tuning them. And Babak and I give an answer, and maybe we can touch base on that again on the data side. Do you want to take a stab at it, Babak, again?
Yes, of course. So the idea is that as data is being contributed through the data contribution side of things, it is being harmonized, and there's some standards of aggregation of the data that does take place through there. The model evaluations only start once we actually have some critical mass of data that has gone through that process. And so we do the evaluations against that data, historical data, obviously, through typical machine learning and model assessment approaches.
The question that Triban had asked was about taking into account true data, and maybe we can try to understand what true data means to you, Triban, if you can answer that, or suggest what true data means to you. We're talking about.
Yeah, Amir, on true data, let me just also say that this is something that we did run into with the X Prize. True data is really fundamental to assessing models. So one of the things we did in X Prize was we actually allowed time to transpire. And that data is, of course, true data, as far as we know, obviously, but it's as true as it gets. And then so we actually had evaluations on the predictors that gave us predictions over time. Then we let time transpire, and then at a certain point in time, check to see how well we did against the true data. So there is, in some cases, that can be part of the assessment for the predictors, not for the prescriptors, obviously. So yeah, that's a great point you're raising with regards to true data.
Yeah, so thank you for the additional questions. We gathering historical data and ground truth. So what will happen during the competition, we had data coming from and validated by Oxford University on a daily gathered data on actual cases, policies surrounding them, the number of transmission, businesses that were open, and then measuring that against the predictions and comparing that. So ground truth and true data are going to be part of that. And we are trying with the data working group also to provide guidelines and support and suggestions and templates about how to contribute data and how this data can be used for the common good and for the project, but also if there are some private data, how those private data can be used for testing the models without releasing that data necessarily. Thank you for your questions. There is another question about participation. And the question reads, to contribute, what resources will be available to contributors like server space or memory or cloud? Babak mentioned that, but maybe Babak will let you answer that again.
Yes, sorry, I was busy trying to type answers in the Q&A. Which question are we talking about?
Is on the open questions, the first one about to contribute, what resources will be available to contributors?
Yes, so there are two levels of contributions. Once the system's up and running, obviously for various different problems that are defined on it, we need contributors to contribute data, to contribute models, to contribute, funding. Absolutely. So that's secondary. We need to build that sort of portal first. So the MVP needs to be in place first. For the MVP, the contributors that we need, Amir had them on a slide there, the types of people that we need. There is some programming that needs to take place. So we need coders, ops folks. We do need some contributions of cloud capacity and processing capacity and storage. But also on the legal, ethics aspects of things, on standards. The list is there. Absolutely, we need contributors that can come in today and help us build this before we get to the phase where we can actually get contributions on the actual projects.
Thank you, Babak. Our plan is to actually provide cloud resources at some point, but during the first phases of the MVP, we're assuming that contributors will have some resources themselves, but soon we'll try to make that available. Thank you for your questions. I'm going to turn to the chairs to ask you if you have any additional comment, remarks for the group before we thank everyone. Mohanty, Sean, any additional? So we're very excited about the project. We've been spending the past 6 months into thinking and simplifying the framework of this project and presenting it to you today. This recording will be available later on. And we're also going to be sharing on Slack the documents, this deck, but also other documents relevant to each working group and to the continuity of the project. And there will be additional resources made available gradually. We are, again, very hopeful. We think that providing an AI on the cloud for any community to be able to go and figure out decision-making that they may not have access to tools, or they may not have access to the data scientists or the data locally, could be useful. And this is a big vision. If we can have a cloud-based AI public service utility, and we'll welcome all of you to join us and help us build this and to make it openly available to everyone. We're excited about to get to know more and to see what excites you about the project. So thank you very much for coming today. And I see there may be another question. So the three working groups, again, let me show you the slides, hopefully to see the three working groups. So the three groups are the group on MVP, the second group is the group on data, and the third group is the work on product experience, persona, and how to engage users. You can see all three groups on the Slack channel with more information. We have been working with a number of localities. We're working with City of Los Angeles, we work with City of with UK, we work with two countries in Nigeria and Tanzania as well. And the teams that have been working on the competition have been working with the local communities, notably two winners in the X-Prize competition on Valencia and in Slovenia have been working with the local localities to develop problem prediction use cases. So we welcome those as well as input as the platform is being built, and gathering every model or every attempt that have been done prior would be very useful as well.
Amir, there's a question in the chat as well. Might want to answer.
Absolutely. Let me just. Maybe you can answer. I don't see any more question. There was a question about localities.
In the chat, not in the Q&A, but in the chat.
Okay. I don't see it. Maybe you can read it, or.
Yeah, it's about a meeting going to be held to discuss details of the MVP, the number of considerations and options that need to take place around it. And also, is there going to be a consortium through which participation takes place? How will outsiders contribute?
When you join on Slack, each working group chair will organize further meetings and welcome you. And they're going to be 2 or 3 weeks of recruitment to see who else wants to join. And each group will have its own rhythm and working, but the groups are going to be connected to each other and working with each other. Any additional details, Babak or Mohanty or Gyumyun?
So in the chat window, I see IP right issue, I think.
Yes, there's a question on IP rights.
Yeah, I believe this one is also a very important point. So whenever we consider data sharing, so we always need to think about how we ensure legal compliance. So that's really important, but it's very difficult to find a solution, but we need to think about this.
Let me add to that. Babak mentioned initially the MVP will be based on publicly available data with no IP rights attached. And also we are creating guidelines so that those who want to contribute data will consider providing some data, and in that case, how that IP rights can be preserved while providing that data. And if it's not preserved, then we cannot use it. But the consideration of IP rights is definitely there, security, privacy, and we're not trying to abuse or ask for data that has IP attached to it. But how we should do that is part of the proposal of this group, and to show benefit of using some data for public benefit while keeping data IP rights separately intact. Thank you very much. If there's no further questions, I'm going to turn to Gillian to help us with some from the logistics. And thank you again for joining. We're very excited. Gillian, up to you.
Right, thank you, Amir, and the other speakers for sharing with us this information. I hope that we're all inspired and ready to contribute to Project Resilience. And if you are, for those of you that haven't joined the Slack channel yet, there's a little bit of homework that we'd like for you to do in 3 parts. So the first is you join us on Slack. And thank you to those who have already joined. Secondly, once you join, tell us a little bit about yourself. What about Project Resilience is interesting to you, and how and where you can help. And the last part of the homework, please invite people in your networks who you think would be a great fit to also contribute to Project Resilience. We'll be sharing next steps very soon in the Slack channel, and this includes information on meeting dates and times, as well as the slides will also be put within the Slack channels for your information. So thank you once again for joining us. You can rewatch this session on the AI for Good YouTube channel. And share it as well with your friends and colleagues for those who missed it. Please also check out the AI for Good program for other informative sessions coming up next that might also be of interest to you. And with that, I'd like to once again thank you all for joining us today, the panel, the participants, and the AI for Good partners, sponsors, and co-convener Switzerland. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again very soon. Right.
Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Rewind selector, rewind selector.